Thank you, everyone. I'm really pleased to see you all here. I realize you could have been watching Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump on Fox, so I'm kind of actually shocked. Or you could have been doing what I would have been doing. You could have been watching the Warriors. We'll have to figure out if we can get it on the. So we make fun of the Japanese for their love affair with robots, but I think the dirty secret is that we are obsessed as a culture with robots as the Japanese. They have come to saturate our films and our books and our culture. And in fact, the difference, it seems to me, is while the Japanese have a love affair with robots, we seem to have this love-hate thing. And in fact, in the last half-decade, we've sort of been gripped with this new kind of anxiety about whether or not they're going to displace us. And I've been reporting about that and thinking about it a lot, and I actually thought about using Dr. Strangelove, because what I really wanted to share with you is sort of my sort of shift from one side to the other, and that's what I'll talk about. I began working on Machines of Loving Grace in 2013, and it's really kind of a summary of reporting that I did during the last 10 years. And this relationship between robots is nuanced, and I'm not entirely pessimistic. I heard someone say both will happen, and I think that's probably true, the good and the bad. But I think that we have a lot to do with it, and when I say we, I mean designers. And my book was largely about the people who design these systems and the decisions they make and the values they have. And sort of, I guess the point of my book, to jump to the conclusion, is we can design ourselves in or out of the future. It's still a very human choice. The machines have not crawled out of the computer yet by themselves, and I don't think they're going to in our lifetime. Let me start basically with where we are. Industrial Perception was this little startup company in Palo Alto that began about 3 or 4 years ago. And they were going to replace the people who load and unload trucks. Now, the significant thing about that video is that that's all made possible by the Xbox. What made this possible was cheap sensors. And in this case, it's the ability to see those boxes in really difficult light conditions. And the Kinect basically caused machine vision to fall from thousands of dollars to under $100. And when you get those kind of changes, you can do new kinds of things. And so the humans who do that take about 6 seconds per box. The boxes weigh up to 70 pounds. They get tired. They hurt their backs. When they got acquired, this company sort of vanished into Google a couple of years ago. They were able to do 1 box every 4 seconds. And they thought they could get to 1 box every 2 seconds. And so, the basic bottom line is the technology is going to be there in terms of routinized blue-collar tasks to do pretty much everything. But my point is that it's complicated. Do a little thought experiment. Think about a job that could be done by machines. Let's talk about making a latte or a cappuccino. Think about going into a Starbucks without baristas. And my point is that it is not just about technology. I began on one side of the spectrum about worrying about displacement, and I've come all the way over, and that's what I wanted to share with you tonight, because I've gone from feeling like no jobs at all to thinking that it's a much more nuanced situation, and it's about what we're going to decide over the next decade or two. So my book begins actually in a previous book that I wrote. I wrote another book about a decade ago called What the Dormouse Said, and it was about stuff that happened right around Stanford campus in the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And there were these 2 laboratories on either side of campus, each about a mile away from Stanford. And one was started by a man by the name of John McCarthy. By the time he showed up at Stanford in 1962, he'd already coined the term artificial intelligence. He'd invented the Lisp programming language. He'd made the first time-sharing system. And he came here with this mission to build a working AI. basically to build a machine that could do all the cognitive and muscular tasks that human beings can do. On the other side of campus, at the same time, 62, there was a man by the name of Doug Engelbart. And Engelbart, basically you know him probably because he invented the computer mouse, he invented hypertext that led to the World Wide Web, and a lot of the technologies in his project at SRI, which was on the other side of campus, made their way first to Xerox PARC, and then to Apple and Microsoft, and they're the technology you use today in computing and the internet. But Engelbart, at the same time that McCarthy was working on artificial intelligence, he coined this other term. The term he used was IA, intelligence augmentation. And I realized that these two laboratories had different philosophical orientations. One was about basically replacing the human, and the other was about augmenting or extending the human. I was very interested in that dichotomy because, of course, it's not just a dichotomy, it's a paradox. Because if you augment a human, you need fewer humans. And so the book is my sort of exploration in that space with the people who are designing the systems. And you can see those two labs and the influence they've had on the world over the last 40 or 50 years since then. The AI community, and then there's this other community called the HCI community, Human-Computer Interaction, which are a group of designers which begin with the human and work outwards. And that was the sort of the tangible tension that I wanted to explore. And it's still very much a reality, underscored, for example, Google, of course, is now building a self-driving car. I would argue that PageRank, the Google search engine, is probably the most powerful IA tool that's ever been created. So Google's kind of conflicted. On the other hand, you have a company like Toyota who just showed up again right next to Stanford campus last fall and is investing $1 billion in a laboratory, not to build self-driving cars, but to build cars that won't crash. And that's IA. And so that's a tangible distinction. And for me, it sort of began in 2004. A man by the name of Tony Tether, who ran DARPA, the Pentagon's think tank, set out to solve a problem for the military because Congress had ordered the Pentagon to turn half of its fleet of ground vehicles into self-driving cars by 2015. Now, it didn't quite work out, but basically he decided to get the hackers involved because the big DoD companies weren't cutting it. And in fact, it's not entire failure because if you actually count up all the aircraft the military has now, more than half of all the Pentagon's planes are actually are drones at this point of some kind. But the first year in 2004 was just an absolute failure. This is the Carnegie Mellon team. You can see it's kind of missed the road there. It missed the road on the other side. And I flew over the contest area at the end of the first contest where everybody failed. And there were these robots, colored robots, littered all over the desert. And it was really quite an embarrassment for Tony Tether. 18 months later, it didn't start out that well for the next generation. This is Sebastian Thrun, the man who headed the Stanford team that built a car called Stanley. I have to tell you, the absolute best thing that can happen to you as a reporter is to be in an accident in a robot that you can walk away from and write about. And Sebastian was, these guys were great. They just straightened the LiDAR out. They took out a piece of code that was doing bad things. We ran off the road at about 30 miles an hour, and then they took off. And ultimately, it had this sort of spectacular ending. It was a very dramatic race in 2005. The Stanford car beat the Carnegie Mellon car. They won a $2 million cash prize, and it touched off a series of events that have sort of led us today. In 2010, I broke the story of the Google car, which was sort of one of my most enjoyable scoops because they had been driving the cars on our freeways for a year and nobody noticed, which is really quite remarkable. If you see that thing, you'd think you would notice it. Maybe somebody would think something was that. But Google was also driving Street View cars, and I think what was happening is that people couldn't tell the difference between the cameras and the LiDAR, and they were also driving them at night. But Sebastian kind of mumbled something to somebody in a bar in Alaska, and then what really sort of broke it for me is I was at my cousin's Christmas party, and my cousin's son said to me, I have this friend who went to high school in Menlo Atherton, and he's now getting paid $15 an hour to work for Google, and he's sitting in a car, but he's not driving. And that was kind of a giveaway. And they gave me the story. Actually, I'd had a lot of quarrels with Google before that, but they gave me that story, and I got my ride in the Google car. And of course, that really transformed Silicon Valley because every car manufacturer was afraid of becoming like a computer manufacturer to Microsoft. They didn't want to be disintermediated, say, rushed to Silicon Valley and built their own laboratories, and that's where we are today. Now, many people think we're on the cusp of self-driving cars, that there's going to be Uber robots and all of that. And I guess my general point tonight is, comes from a guy by the name of Paul Sappho. Never mistake a clear view for a short distance. And the bet I'm making, that I've made publicly, is that if the Uber robot comes to my house in San Francisco in 2025, and it drives me to Palo Alto for dinner, I'm buying. So while it seems that we're very close, we're going to get things like Super Cruise and related things, but getting to complete self-driving cars, I think, is hard. Sebastian took me out in his Tesla a couple weeks ago after they introduced so-called autopilot, and we drove up 280 and got off in Jefferson, and I swear to God, the car almost killed us 10 times. So Elon, you know, he's turned his user base into beta testers, basically, is what's happening. But what has happened in Silicon Valley, and I'm sure you all noticed in the last 6 months, you know, it was about social networking. And 6 months ago, it was clear it was about machine intelligence. Machine intelligence has become the bright, shining thing in Silicon Valley. And I just wanted to give you a sort of a historical context to think about what's happening now, because we all think the future is almost here. There is this notion of this thing called the singularity, which of course is this notion of an intelligence explosion. We'll ride on Moore's law, and pretty soon these machines will be more intelligent than we were. It's Silicon Valley's unofficial religion. And the idea is that, driven by Moore's law, things don't just get faster, but they get faster, faster, and they also get cheaper faster. That's the most important thing. Actually, there's just, you know, if any of you sort of are into that perspective, I really would recommend you read this wonderful book by a professor of religion called Apocalyptic AI, which makes the link between sort of our belief system here in Silicon Valley and the belief system of earlier religions. It's really quite good. But there are AI researchers like Ray Kurzweil and Jeff Hawken who believe that we understand the fundamental underlying nature of cognition, and it's just a matter of scaling up. And what I want to say is that this is a field that's overpromised and underdelivered for decades. We've been here before, and I want to take you all the way back to the beginning. This is the first article I could find. This appeared in the New York Times in a UPI article. It was about the invention of the perceptron, and they made the claim at that point that we would have a machine that could think and read in 1 year. So that's what they thought in 1958. So you can move on. That was Frank Rosenblatt, who was one of the people who did early neural network research. This is a man by the name of Charlie Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt came to SRI in the late 1950s. He gave a talk about perceptrons. Rosenblatt, who was a transistor expert, got really interested, and he built the first truly autonomous robot platform. It was called Shaky. It was seen back then as kind of a failure. It had a lot of problems. When he first sold the Pentagon on the idea was that he would build a sentry that would guard military bases, and they asked him, can it carry a gun? And he said, well, how many do you want? But it never really made it out of the lab. However, as a platform, the stuff that you now use in your smartphones to navigate with, there was an algorithm for navigation called A-star that was done on that. And Nuance, which led to Siri, also started right there. So it had a big change in the world. And it also had its star turn in the world. This was an article in Life magazine, 1970. Shaky was the first electronic person. And of course, Marvin Minsky, who just recently died, was quoted as saying in 1970, "In from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. I mean a machine that will be able to read Shakespeare, grease a car, play office politics, tell a joke, have a fight. At that point, the machine will begin to educate itself with fantastic speed. In a few months, it will be at genius level, and a few months after that, the powers will be incalculable." Now, Marvin claims he never said that. However, there was undeniable optimism about the future of AI at that point. And on the other side of campus, this is going back to SAIL. That's the SAIL cart, which really was the first self-driving vehicle. John McCarthy, in his first proposal to DARPA, asserted that building a working AI, something with all the intellectual and muscular capabilities of a human being, was a 10-year project in 1972. So of course, after that, we had 2 AI winters. In the late 1970s, the British had the first one. There was government funding that was cut off. for AI research. And actually, it had this really neat, long-term sort of positive consequence. A man by the name of Jeff Hinton, who was an early AI researcher, left England because he couldn't get funding, and he came first to the United States, then to Canada, and now to Google, where he's responsible for much of the deep belief nets and deep neural nets that are now sort of beginning to, again, change things again. But then after that, in the 1980s, Star Wars, which was the Strategic Defense Initiative, sort of collapsed, and there were a whole set of early AI companies, commercial companies like Technology. Symantec started as an AI company, and they all basically collapsed in the mid-1980s. But it seems like we're right back there again. You know, Bullwinkle, that trick never works. This time for sure. And if you're trying to report on what's going on in the Valley, we believe that AI can do everything, and it's going to do it soon. And so this is kind of the model. This is this wonderful company, Boston Dynamics, started by a man by the name of Mark Raybert. And Mark is really the best designer of walking robots in the world. And they're actually spectacular. I mean, I have to keep updating this video because he keeps releasing videos. And the funny joke about this is when he put this video out, he only showed Google PR the snow walking stuff. He didn't show them the other stuff. And then so when they see stuff like that, Google PR freaks out, because they obviously think Terminator. I mean, this is spectacular stuff, but I'm showing it to you to make a point. This was the last one. So Andy Rubin, who built the Android phone for Google, and then he bought more than a dozen companies. When he was going around sort of selling people on the vision of what Google was going to do, he had this idea that the Google car would drive up to your house, and the Google robot would hop off the back bumper and run the package up to your house. And if you're competing with Amazon's drone.
But it would be poetic.
But now notice.
It's like a bumper biter, right?
Pay no attention to the man with the backpack. But that was really the most important thing in the video. Those are teleoperated robots. They're not autonomous robots. Walking around in the world, in an unstructured world, is hard, and it remains hard. And let me give you an example of how hard it is. So these are the same robots. This is the DARPA Robotics Challenge last year. This is 24 teams, each with millions of dollars, with 2 years of research to do 8 simple tasks: to be able to walk, to be able to drive, to be able to open a door, to be able to operate a power tool. The DARPA Robotics Challenge was created by the Pentagon to try to do things in really harsh environments where humans couldn't act. And three of the 24 robots actually solved the 8 tasks, and they did it in about 45 minutes, something that you could do in about 5. But the son of the researcher who actually organized this conference, a man by the name of Gil Pratt, who now is building Toyota's lab. Because one of the things they had trouble, most of the robots had trouble opening the door. And so what Joel Pratt said is, if you're worried about the Terminator, just keep your door closed. So let's go back to Moore's Law, which once again is sort of Silicon Valley's religion. And the reason I put this chart on the screen is because it's been a free ride in a lot of ways for people who do design work. I mean, you get these fantastic increases in power and decreases in price, and it's a free ride, and we've had it for almost 40 years. And the argument is that it's going to lead to a productivity explosion. Now, ignore it for a moment, the fact that, productivity statistics, despite 3 decades of this technology, have been episodic at best. We haven't seen this productivity explosion yet. And this is the more significant slide. What's happened is that Moore's Law is not dead, but it's really creaking. It's like it's going to be over. And the most damning sort of evidence of that is the cost of transistors for the semiconductor industry has stopped falling. They're not getting cheaper faster anymore. For the last 2 years, they've been flat. And so that means there's no incentive to redo the same circuit over again because it's cheaper. And you know, that's the sort of the last of several straws. There's something called Dennard scaling, which is a corollary to Moore's law, and that is that computers get faster, faster, and that actually ended in 2006, and nobody noticed that, you know, the same Intel PC has been 3 gigahertz for about that long. Then the other really remarkable thing is Intel had this strategy called tick-tock. They do a new design, and then the next year they'd shrink it. They do a new design, and they'd shrink it. And it was this unbelievable sort of freight train, and last year it stopped. Didn't stop dead, but it slowed way down. And so you put all that together, and we have maybe 2 or 3 more generations to go from 14 nanometers to 7 nanometers, and so we're going to get there. We're going to get more powerful, less expensive machines, but at a slower rate, and then it's going to stop dead. So I have a slight confession. This anxiety I was talking about, the concern about being displaced by machines, I'm kind of part of the problem. In 2010, 2011, I started to see things where these automation technologies were not just affecting low-cost labor. They were beginning to affect skilled white-collar workers, like lawyers. I was seeing evidence that $35 an hour paralegals and $400 an hour attorneys were actually being displaced by software called e-discovery software. It could do a demonstrably better job of reading documents. And you know, after that, there were about 6 books that came out, 2 by Brynildson and McAfee, 2 by Martin Ford, 1 by Jaron Lanier, all basically making the same argument. And that was probably best expressed by Moshe Vardi, this Rice computer scientist, sort of makes the argument that by 2045, all human labor will be done by machines. Now, for a reporter, there's also the International Federation of Robotics who makes the case that we're going to have the biggest job renaissance in history. And so you look at both of those and you realize that both of them can't be right, but it's really a great time. But I began to worry that Keynes, the economist who made the argument in the 1930s that technology displaces jobs, it doesn't displace work, that Keynes was wrong, that this was something fundamentally different. And for a couple of reasons, I've come back around to become a Keynesian in my old age. And let me sort of make the case of why. And it's because of this man. This is Danny Kahneman. And I was talking to Kahneman a couple of years ago, and my hair was on fire. I said, look, automation is going to come to China. They're going to displace the workers. They're going to have disruptions. They're going to have labor unrest. And he says, you don't get it. He said, in China, if they're lucky, the robots will come just in time. And I said, excuse me? And he took me through China's demographic picture. And when you understand that it's a rapidly aging society with a growing population of people who are not working and a significant population because of the one-child population, they will not have a growing number of young workers until 2050, even with this 2-child policy. You get a very different picture of the relationship of the population and the workforce. So it's really quite striking. In the world as a whole, by the end of the century, the number of people over 80 will have gone up by 7-fold. In the world right now, today, for the first time in history, there are fewer people who are under 5 than who are over 65. And so when you start to see this, and this is happening everywhere in the world except for Africa. It's happening in India, it's happening in Japan, in spades. They have ghost cities, ghost houses where people aren't living. It's happening in Korea. We're a little bit different because we permit immigration, strangely enough. So we have this inflow of young workers. It's happening in Europe in spades. And so I really sort of reversed what I thought about it. I now go around and I talk to roboticists and I say, when do you think it will be the case that you can build a robot that will be able to give a shower to an aging human? And nobody can give me a date. It's a really hard problem. There's lots of progress being made. There's a guy by the name of Peter Abeel at Berkeley who's doing amazing things applying deep learning to grasping. So I'm not sure that it's possible the robots may come just in time. But I do believe that demography trumps technology. So a couple more thoughts back to our existential threat. You know, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates and Nick Bostrom have all weighed in on this notion that we're going to get this intelligence explosion. And then when you look at Moore's law, you realize, you know, we might have this kind of progress, but it's going to depend on you, the designers. It's going to depend more on human creativity, and it's going to be episodic. We're not going to get a free ride in the future. So it may not come as quickly as you thought. And so, you know, this all comes from sci-fi. We're all steeped in sci-fi. I mean, pick a movie. Ex Machina, Chappie, Terminator, Transcendence. My favorite is Her. And my favorite, and with, you know, you had plenty of time to see it, so here's the spoiler. In Her, there is an intelligent explosion, there is a singularity, and there are these super smart beings, and guess what? They're bored of us. They're not going to kill us. They're going to go off and do something interesting. I think that is actually the much more likely consequence of a technology explosion, if it happens, and I don't believe it's going to happen in our lifetime. However, I do think it's great that they raised the issue, because I do think there's a significant issue around autonomous systems. This is a weapon called LRASM, Long Range Anti-Ship Missile. We are just on the verge of appropriating $1 billion to build these and put them into the fleet in 2018. And what's so interesting about this weapon, it's not called an autonomous weapon, it's called a semi-autonomous weapon. And what makes a semi-autonomous weapon is a human picks the target. But it gets really like a slippery slope, because LRASM can fly for 500 miles without any contact with the real world. It's got GPS, it's got inertial guidance, it's got all this stuff. And when it gets to the enemy fleet, it picks the target. Now, when they were testing this in Hawaii a couple of years ago, it actually managed to hit a commercial freighter, so things can go wrong. But for many different kinds of weapon systems, we're posed at that moment where we're about to cross over the line. And I think that it's one of the sort of crucial issues for us to, not just in autonomy is sort of something that's facing us everywhere, in cars, in planes, and in weapon systems. And it's something that we can address. So, you know, you're all familiar with the term cyborg. Cyborg was originally coined by NASA scientists to basically sort of address the idea of sending people into space, and they figured you'd have to evolve them. Now, of course, cyborg is no longer a science fiction term. People are putting things into themselves. It all seems quite real. There are people who walk with the aid of these amazing robotic and run with the aid of these amazing robotic extensions. Where I worry, and we have the Obama Brain Initiative, for example. This will make you think. It's not just about reading from 1 million neurons at once. That's the goal. They also want to be able to write to 1 million neurons at once. What could possibly go wrong? Borg is the root of cyborg. Borg refers to, if you've all seen Star Trek, you know, resistance is futile, you may be assimilated. So think about cloud robotics, which is this wonderful idea, and it's sort of what sets these machines apart from us. If these things are all interconnected, when one of them learns something, they all know it immediately. And it's very real. As we get towards self-driving cars, an Israeli company at CES this year made this really neat announcement with Ford and VW that all of the cars on the freeway are going to be sensors. They're all going to be collecting data. They will have a real-time map of the entire world. So that's already reality. I think it's really important to keep a bright line between the augmented capabilities that are coming to the human species and humanity. One of the best things about being human is we have individuality, and I worry about that slipping away. Let me end with Norbert Wiener, which takes us all the way back to the beginning. Wiener was an engineer who coined the term cybernetics in 1947, and he began to realize right away what was possible with these machines. And he then wrote this book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and I think that's the key point, is that we design these machines and we can decide to design ourselves into or out of the future. We can be humble and live a good life with the aid of the machines, or we can be arrogant and die. So thank you very much.